pub. This is pub conversations, right? These are unanswerable questions that no one knows the answer to.
Well, in which case, you're probably not going to like the next bit, Adam.
Oh, no.
Hey, did you ask Andrew about the Boltzmann brain paradox like I asked you to?
Yes, I did. Yeah, trust Hannah to come up with it. That is the most philosophical point you could have asked about. And in fact, it's a sort of Achilles heel in cosmology right now, because if you ask what seems like a fairly reasonable question, which is where in space and time are typical conscious people located? So it's a sort of question about where does life arise? Where could consciousness arise? And you make a stab at answering, obviously it's a very difficult question to answer, but you make a stab at answering that. You get completely nonsensical answers. And one of the nonsensical answers you get is actually, in the far future of the universe, there's so much of it, there's so much space, there's so much time still to come, that there'll be plenty of time for just random events to take place, where randomly a brain just appears out of nothing. Now, this is due to something called quantum mechanics, and the effect in quantum mechanics that anything can appear out of nothing and then disappear again. Obviously, it's incredibly rare for a brain to appear out of nothing and disappear. We'd notice if these things kept popping up around us. But there is so much time in the future that occasionally one of these things will pop into existence and then disappear. And because there is so much of that time available, it's possible that the Boltzmann brains, that's what they're called, outnumber the real biological brains. And it gets worse, because then you say, well, I'm probably typical. I mean, I should probably be a sort of typical person in the history of the whole cosmos. Therefore, I should expect myself to be one of those brains. And the fact that I think I'm talking to you about cosmology now, I think I have a day-to-day life, it's probably just the result of random fluctuations that led to the neurons firing in a particular way to give me the illusion of a normal life. You can see why nobody takes this terribly seriously, but it's kind of worrying for cosmology because we don't really know what the way out of that is. We can see it's nonsensical, but we don't really know exactly what is wrong with the arguments that lead to that conclusion. I get that not everyone is taking this seriously and it's more like a pub conversation. It doesn't feel like it has a natural place in science as I understand it, though. How is it progressing the narrative of understanding the universe?
It's a fun idea, though, isn't it? I mean, if you really think about it, scientifically, you can't tell the difference between your brain, you right there, Adam Rutherford, sitting there with all of your history and everything that you know, and a simulated Boltzmann brain that just popped into existence with the belief, the feeling of all of that history. You cannot tell the difference between reality and non-reality, and that's fun.
God, I wish the universe would end quite soon based on this conversation. I just don't understand why that's helping us, because, and maybe this is the difference between our subjects, in that if I started speculating about the origins of humankind to a similar degree as the Boltzmann brain paradox, then we'd be talking about spirits and pixies and origin myths.
I think that's the point, right? You just don't know where this stuff's going to end up, because there are lots of occasions where scientists have imagined something either in an equation or philosophically, like special relativity, for example, which in the end ends up holding true and being verifiable by experiment. You just don't know where you're going.
I mean, I did ask Andrew if he was planning to introduce any actual evidence into this process of understanding the structure of the early universe, and he told me what types of things they should be looking for. There are multiple different ways that you might go looking for evidence, but probably one of the best things you can
they have been, the data that was initially presented had been independently analysed before those press releases were put out. That's not the case here, but generally speaking, the process is the same. These are mass trials, up to 40,000 people being vaccinated, fairly similar technology being used to the AstraZeneca-Oxford vaccine, for example, and the results are equally positive. Although Russia has been very political about this, certainly it's been somewhat trumpeting its results and has very much been comparing itself with the UK vaccine, pointing to its own as being more effective and also cheap and accessible.
Sarah, thank you. Sarah Rainsford in Moscow. In Serbia, the bishop who led the funeral service of the head of the Orthodox Church who died of COVID-19 has himself tested positive for the virus. Bishop David of Kruševac is reported to have been admitted to hospital. Bishop David of Kruševac is reported to have been admitted to hospital in the capital, Belgrade, from where our Balkans correspondent Guy Delaunay joins me now. Guy, what do we know about Bishop David and how he may have caught COVID?
Well, it would fit in with the narrative, wouldn't it, that you had the Patriarch dying of COVID-19, having caught it while after presiding at the funeral of another bishop in Montenegro at the start of the month. But in this case, it does seem that Bishop David of Kruševac was unwell on Sunday, actually during the funeral of Patriarch Irene in Belgrade. He said he felt okay at the start of the service, but sometime into it he started coughing, therefore got himself tested immediately after the service, did test positive for COVID-19. It's actually the second time this year that he's tested positive for coronavirus, and he was admitted to hospital in Belgrade as a result.
And the Patriarch Irene, who died last Friday, was himself thought to have... And the Patriarch Irene, who died last Friday, was himself thought to have caught it at the funeral of another senior cleric in Montenegro, wasn't he?
Well, that's right. And what was notable about both these events, both the funeral of Patriarch Irene on Sunday and the funeral of Metropolitan Amphilochia in clergy were not wearing masks during the service.
Kissing the glass screen. Now,
Yes,
are the authorities going to tighten restrictions now?
Parking mode off.
You're right about kissing the glass, Alex. The day before the funeral, Patriarch Irene was lying in state in the cathedral, and people were kissing the glass of this coffin, and an epidemiologist has pointed out, well, that's a great way of spreading germs. In terms of restrictions, new restrictions are coming into place today in Serbia. All shops and other facilities, all businesses will have to close from 6 o'clock in the evening. Gatherings are limited, but we're not sure yet whether that applies to church services as well.
Guy, thank you. Guy Delaunay in Belgrade. You're listening to the BBC World Service. Justine has the headlines.
3 weeks after the US election, the formal handover of power from Donald Trump to President-elect Joe Biden has begun. Russian scientists have announced further positive data from trials of their coronavirus vaccine. And as you've been hearing, the bishop who led the funeral service of the head of the Serbian Orthodox Church who died with coronavirus is now in hospital with the disease.
After nearly 3 weeks of fighting, the UN Security Council is due to hold its first meeting on the conflict in northern Ethiopia later. Talks come amid conflicting claims and counterclaims from